Hello, I'm Shahan Ramkissoon. Thanks for joining us here in New York City. You're watching Arise News Now, your fast forward to stories that affect you, making headlines around the world in this hour. As the Ebola death toll rises, more U.S. troops land in Liberia to help out. And there's new information about the man who died of Ebola in Dallas, Texas. Fighting in the Syrian border town of Kobani intensifies. Turkey sits by watching, while the UN warns of dire consequences if ISIS takes control. And two winners of the Nobel Peace Prize, one of them the youngest ever, and both committed to protecting the young the world over. Those stories and more straight ahead. The fight against Ebola is slowly but surely intensifying. Additional U.S. troops have touched down in Liberia to help contain the virus and treat hundreds of people seeking medical care. American soldiers are currently building a hospital for Liberian health workers who have contracted Ebola. 100 military personnel landed in the country today, bringing the total number of troops in Liberia to just over 300. Meanwhile, lawmakers in Liberia have rejected a proposal to restrict movement and public gatherings as a measure to combat the virus. The UN says without mass mobilization of the world, it will be impossible to get it under control. Arise News contributor Akhtar Khan has more.
It's a killer that's hard to stop. The Ebola virus has now claimed more than 4,000 lives. The World Health Organization confirmed today the exact number of 4,033 out of 8,399 confirmed, probable and suspected cases in 7 countries, with Liberia the worst hit, recording 2,316 deaths. Governments are now acting fast to try to contain the virus. U.S. lawmakers agreed to use $750 million in war funds to fight Ebola. Today, 100 Marines arrived in Liberia on top of the 300 already there to help with the logistics, aid efforts to prevent spread of the virus. It's part of the 3,000 troops committed already by President Obama in the fight against Ebola. This on top of the $1 billion the United Nations says it needs to combat the virus.
Over $20 million has been raised for the Multi-Party Trust Fund in the last week, but we need more. We need much more.
A failure to act now, while we have the chance, could lead to unpredictable but very dire consequences for the people of the countries and well beyond.
That's kick-started a response from many countries, especially within Europe, to step up efforts to combat the virus after a Spanish nurse who recently travelled back from West Africa is in a critical condition. EU ministers have now called an emergency meeting to address the epidemic.
From the experience we have decided alongside a scientific committee and international organizations to consider everyone who has treated a patient with Ebola as high-risk contacts to be actively monitored.
Above all, let me remind you that the epidemic is developing in West Africa, and we must above all be fighting it there. It's our responsibility, and France accepts that responsibility totally.
But despite the large number of deaths now recorded, there is hope. MAP Biopharmaceutical is boosting production of its experimental Ebola vaccine ZMapp. Currently, there is no licensed Ebola vaccine, but treatments are in development.
Now back in the U.S., more details emerged about Thomas Eric Duncan, the first man to be diagnosed with Ebola here. Duncan died on Wednesday at a Dallas hospital. Medical records show his temperature was at 103 degrees Fahrenheit when he visited the emergency unit, but he was sent home. Even after telling a nurse he had just arrived from Africa and showed symptoms of Ebola, the Liberian man was discharged with just antibiotics. The hospital says it made procedural changes. Meanwhile, a spokesperson for the Texas Health Department says the agency is thinking about investigating the hospital for possibly not complying with state health and safety laws. Fighting rages on in the Syrian Kurdish city of Kobani near the Turkish border. Reports now emerging that authorities are saying key government buildings are fallen to terrorist group ISIS. But the government is yet to confirm this. Intense fighting between ISIS and outmanned Kurdish forces, could be heard from across the border in Turkey. As U.S.-led airstrikes hit Kobani, Turkish tanks continued to just sit by and watch without acting. The UN predicts thousands of people are likely to be massacred if ISIS gains control of the city. It's urging the Turkish government to act. Deborah Letterbeck reports.
Black clouds mark the horizon near the Syrian border with Turkey, a now familiar signature of the battle for control of Kobani. Turkey has so far resisted calls to intervene. But now UN envoy to Syria, Staffan de Mistura, is appealing to Ankara for help.
Kobani Ain al-Arab falls. There will be close to 400 kilometers of the Turkish border to be basically under control of ISIL out of the 900. And what will be next? Other villages? Even Aleppo?
The envoy says it is no secret what will happen if Islamic State or ISIL gains control of the town.
We have seen it, what ISIL is capable of doing when they take over a city. We know what they are capable of doing with their own victims, with women, children, minorities, and hostages. After Mosul, this time, it is announced, and one reason more for actually looking at it in a different way.
The U.S. is still conducting airstrikes near Kobani, but Turkey, while stationing tanks on hills overlooking the town, has so far refused to intervene. Ankara is demanding a comprehensive deal with the U.S. and other allies on the Syrian civil war before committing its military to the fight against Islamic State.
Changes to voting laws ahead of the November election is causing concern. Early voting, same-day registration, and provisional ballots in Ohio and North Carolina could lead to low voter turnout. Meanwhile, a new study shows African Americans and young people will be most affected. Earlier, I spoke with the Wise News Washington correspondent Leila McDowell. I asked her for more details on what the studies on voter ID laws revealed.
What this study showed is that restrictive voter ID laws did cause a drop in voter turnout. Now, what they did is they compared several states with and without photo ID before the law and after, and found that particularly among young people and African Americans who often lack the government-issued ID that's required, those drops were significant. They averaged around 4%, which could make a real difference in a tight political race.
Now, how do these laws impact African Americans and young people specifically?
Well, the issue is they don't have the same access to government ID. So, for example, you take an elderly black woman who may have been born during an era when there was segregation and they didn't allow African Americans in the hospitals and they didn't keep birth certificates. She's going to and this is actually a real case, she was, and she demonstrated for voting rights. She marched in those civil rights demonstrations for voting rights, and she's voted in every election for the past 50 years, but she's barred from voting now because she doesn't have that birth certificate in order to get the government-issued ID. In urban areas, for example, you have many young people who don't drive, and they don't have voter ID. In Milwaukee, for example, about 60% of young black men do not have this government-issued ID. So they are much more likely not to have it than, say, white Americans and elderly Americans, and that's why it impacts African Americans, senior citizens, veterans, the disabled, and college students disproportionately.
Lastly, very briefly, Leila, just tell us who's more unhappy about this, Democrats or Republicans?
Well, Republicans are cheering because these people happen to be the Democratic base. This is the Obama electorate and the coalition that swept many Democrats into office. So anything that can depress turnout in a tight race where 2, 3, 4% can make all the difference is going to make Republicans happy. Democrats are very concerned because in midterms, there's a low turnout amongst the Democratic base anyway. And now you've got these restrictive voter ID laws in many key states, battleground states, where there's some tight races, and they're very, very concerned that that could mean that the Senate could switch from Democrat to Republican.
If you swiped your credit and debit cards at Kmart recently, beware and listen up. Sears has announced a data breach at its Kmart stores that started in September. The company says its IT team detected the breach on Thursday and immediately launched a full-scale investigation with a security firm. Kmart was able to quickly remove the malicious software, but it believes certain debit and credit card numbers have been compromised. The company couldn't say how many cards were affected. A flight attendants union says it wants passengers to stow cell phones and other electronic devices during takeoff and landing, citing safety concerns. Since last year's FAA ruling, 31 airline operators were cleared to allow passengers to use electronics. The National Archives released papers that show how the White House defended President Bill Clinton against political fallout over his affair with Monica Lewinsky. About 10,000 pages of records involving Lewinsky and the Whitewater investigation were released. The papers include lists of questions for interviews and the efforts to guide the president through impeachment. Oklahoma unveiled a renovated execution chamber in a move to address problems during the state's last execution. The botched execution of condemned murderer Clayton Lockett prompted the $106,000 upgrade. It includes medical equipment, new restraint and intercom systems, and an ECG machine, including a backup system. In addition, the state is implementing new execution protocols. Oklahoma has 3 scheduled executions in November and December. President Barack Obama designated nearly 350,000 acres of San Gabriel Mountains in California as a national monument. Latino organizations and environmentalists lobbied for more than 10 years to safeguard the site. It provides critical green space and fresh water to the area's large Latino population. But opponents expressed concern about the new limits on land use and how the designation will affect development of the area. Microsoft CEO wishes he could take it back. At a conference to celebrate women in computing, Satya Nadella was asked how women should get ahead in the tech world.
It's not really about asking for the raise, but knowing and having faith that the system will actually give you the right raises as you go along. And that, I think, might be one of the additional superpowers that, quite frankly, women who don't ask for a raise have, because that's good karma.
In response, Maria Clower, president of Harvey-Mudd College and members of Microsoft board, immediately said his viewpoint was one of the few things she disagrees with him on.